And now, getting into the fun part here, this is the 10 profile types, and we hit it very early on when you came in. I showed you the team report of our team. You remember we roll up as an engager team. So definitely sort of lean on the fast-paced side. Let's move things along, more relationship-driven, because we have a number of engagers here. So Keith and Nikki and I are over here. Paul's here. So, you know, we might feel like things need to move a little faster. Let's get through the materials. But the true sort of going through some of these conversations can be pretty powerful. And we all sort of keep engaged, but I just wanted to show you sort of the results over here and the relationships over here. And each one of those unlocking guide pages will break down sort of each characteristic of each of these 10 profiles. So the other thing that's very interesting about this, and it's split here in the middle, more fast-paced, moves carefully. So have you ever been in a situation, if you've been a leader or you're working with people, and I always use the example, like working with Hugh, he can go from A to Z really quickly. That reflective thinker that he was talking about needed B to Y a little bit more sort of sequentially, because that's how he can get his work done. So down here, it means that I may need a little bit more guidance than people think up here. Just moves carefully and very fast-paced. So recognize that a lot of times, and that's, again, gets back to that stat, 87% of business issues are communication related. It's usually because you're sort of not, they're not comfortable to ask questions because you're moving so fast. And they feel a little maybe apprehensive to ask a question because it may feel even remedial. Hey, I don't understand. So make it safe, because these people truly, with the exception of the stylish thinker, because they sort of operate all over, you know, very much on the relationship, outgoing, and results. But recognize that if you sort of tap into that, especially in coaching, you can get a lot of breakthroughs for people. That's why we spend a lot of time with our team, that they understand their profiles, they understand how we work, because you can lead to much better results when you are in a cohesive team. And I do a lot of work in team performance. And if you're familiar with the concept of a team coming together that's forming, you move to the next stage of storming, then norming, and then performing. And you can get high business results when you're in performing. But most teams never get out of storming because they never really understand that if I process differently than this person, that means that they don't understand me. You know, make it easy for people to sort of understand that they're feeling that they're self-empowered to ask questions. And you really can have great performance in an organization if you have a distribution within this wheel. But what I find is leaders hire people just like themselves, because you connect with somebody that, you know, it's going to be fast-paced, or it's going to be, you know, that you need to chat a little bit more. So you got to be really sort of intentional when you're hiring for certain roles, that you're hiring the right behavioral fit for the role. Does that make sense? Okay, and we'll study a little bit more around this. And as Hugh mentioned, a lot of times, like for, you know, if you're opposite, like a strategist with a community builder, that would be a hard relationship for them, the two of them, if they don't understand each other, to work together, because they just process so differently. Same thing with the influencer and the folks down on this side. Does that make sense? We're going to have a couple of repeating slides that'll sort of tap into that, but this is really important to know. Again, to Monique's question about, you know, how am I, you know, as far as like the rest of the population, the distribution. I think we have a slide here that'll show the distribution, but we all are uniquely wired, but this helps to teach it, to understand it, and how people work together. Any questions on the slide? Okay. Oh, this is the distribution. So you can see here, strategists are 16% of the population. And as Hugh mentioned, we validate that every year, sort of to see if it's changed. It really hasn't changed at all. So that distribution is very consistent around the world, because we do have Profiles done in 123 different countries. So it's very, very consistent. Facilitators is actually the lowest number of facilitators at 4%. And we have one on our team. Adapters are 10%. Go back here. Adapters, which I'm going to cover. Adapters are quite unique because if you think about the bell curve, if you looked at their one-page factor, they'd be 50 almost all the way through. They don't have a lot of deviation in their scoring. They're very adaptable people. And I have one that we work with that he is literally 50 on almost all of his factor scores. And I like to interview him because I'm like, what sort of drives you? He actually does some very interesting things. But he said, I feel like I can do anything, but I'm not a master at anything. And that's what you see with adapters. They just sort of can fit in anywhere. They're very adaptable anywhere in the business. So if you have one, they're sort of interesting, can be a utility player. But they sort of getting to their passion can be a little more challenging. Question? Oops.
When you've taken one report, is the data that's in there able to be applied to a financial DNA review?
It is.
Do you have to keep retaking it for each
No.
time, or one time
One
you can
time.
choose how you want it
Yeah.
applied?
And you can run that report. You can run any of the reports that are in the system. It's sort of, in the way that our business has worked, it's sold on a subscription basis. So if you're a business DNA subscriber like Tyler's company, they really have visibility to business DNA. And then for Michelle's company, they have both financial DNA and business DNA. And that's what Keith will have. So it's just the access to be able to do that. But all the reports are really run off of the 46 questions. So we can really run, if we were doing a financial DNA session, we'd be able to look at the financial DNA side of all of our, sort of how we make decisions, our behavioral biases. So it's kind of a very unique offering to be able to do that. Any questions on the distribution, any of the profiles? We'll get into them a little bit more. And then I want to show you sort of how we actually construct the profiles. So you'll notice there's only 5 of the 8 here, because the last 3 being the risk, or the pioneering, the risk, and the creativity can be sort of, in all of the 10 profiles, can be different. So it doesn't say that every initiator is creative, because some initiators are more experience-based or anchored. But these 5 really make up the core of how we calculate the profile. So an adapter, I mentioned, is 50 on the bell curve, right down the center. So for those of us that are initiators, a little bit more take charge, tend to be a little reserved, fast-paced, a little bit on the spontaneous side, and then we're a little more skeptical. Paul, stylish thinker, cooperative, outgoing, fast-paced, planned, and that one is skeptical. Does that make sense? I'm not going to go through all 10, but I just want to see the construction of that. You typically see when somebody completes the profile, they'll follow this line. But I had a story last year where we had somebody go through this. She's actually an owner of a pet supply company, a retail outlet. She's a strategist. I was totally confused. I'm like, how can you be a strategist and be sort of working with customers? Because she was so cooperative. And she said she struggled a lot, but she had such a personality so she could connect. But underneath, she had all of this planning and sort of driving that was going on, and her frustration with clients. It can be quite an awakening to go through this process. Any questions on this? I don't expect you to memorize it, but it's a great tool to use. Then I talked about the adapter, highly flexible, because if you actually looked at my one-page factor, I'm actually very close to an adapter, except I have this spontaneity and this risk-taking that sort of put me into the initiator category. But I can sort of fit in. If you looked at my career, I can do a lot of different things and have done. But if somebody in your group, somebody completes the profile, this is a very important thing to know. If they're going through such emotional change, like they've had a death, sort of something that's really caught them off guard, they've lost their job, something that's caused emotional stress for them and they haven't yet gotten out of it, they might score as an adapter. And the way to detect if they're truly an adapter is to run that one-page factor report, and you can see if there's scoring pattern where they're very cooperative, but they're having these swings between the categories. That's not what they're not an adapter. You can politely ask them if they're going through some big changes, and you'll usually point to it. They were just answering inconsistently these 46 questions. It was like there's so much confusion going on in their life that they couldn't answer it correctly. And in our financial DNA world, you could potentially building a financial plan based on this information. So our recommendation is to have the person take it 6 months later when they're probably out of that emotional crisis. And I've had a couple that have gone through that. It's not the best time, if you're a coach, it might be a good time to sort of maybe not use the information, but just to help them unblock some of this. But you really would like them to probably retake it. It's the only time we would recommend having somebody retake it.
Does that hold true to any of these themes coming out of that pattern of the 10 that you showed? Is that just the adapter?
It's the adapter. And it's because when they were going through it, they literally answered so inconsistently. And they're just good. They're not sort of thinking as clearly as they would out of stress. And so if you detect that somebody's really going through a lot of life changes, God forbid, like the loss of a child would be not the time to sort of go through this. Just something that is really sort of traumatic, then it may not be the best time for them to complete this process. You may have other tools in the toolbox to be able to do that. That make sense? Happens infrequently, but it might happen. And if you are wondering about it, you can give me, Nikki, and I a call, and we can help you. I can actually see it. What's interesting is I can literally see what the person would be. It's quite interesting to see. It's just not 100%. So and we don't want to go into the system and change it. So they'll score as an adapter. And then I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but this gives you a little bit of insight into the scoring for the typical scoring pattern. All scores are between 45 and 55 for an adapter. Community builders have this preference. So you can see here, each one of them have their unique scoring pattern. That's how this is constructed. And we're not really here to sort of go through construction, but I wanted you to see how this is created so you see the difference on the bell curve.